I'm going to be talking about three different things, and they're all really to do with making better connections, doing more joined-up thinking, engaging with a wider circle of players and partners so that we can deliver more effectively on the kinds of things that we are all passionate about. So the first of the issues is the economic function of nature, the ecosystem services stuff which lots of you are engaged with all the time, I suspect, these days. The second is technical innovation, and it was very good hearing. We had quite a flavour of that in a couple of the short presentations just before coffee, I think. The idea that we're at last engaging with the technological world at the same time as hanging on to our naturalistic roots. And the third thing is about alliances, and particularly unholy alliances, and getting out of the comfort zone and finding ways of working with the kinds of people that we don't really have a lot of experience of engaging with. And I'm just going to use three examples of the way in which I think that might work. And the business of communications is really challenging in all of this. If you are running an Indian takeaway in Shrewsbury with 2 feet of water in your shop, trying to make the connection between that and sphagnum moss is one hell of a challenge. But that is actually the kind of territory that we are occupying now. A recognition that actually if we're going to address the urban flooding issue, we need to find ways of working with natural systems, and in the case of Shrewsbury, they may be 100 miles away in a different country. The Severn that's flowing through their shop starts life in Plinlimmon, and it starts life in a landscape which has been overgrazed and overdrained and has been designed to shed its rainwater. So we have to begin to make those kinds of connections and to recognise that landscapes we don't even see, species that we've never even heard of, may very well hold the key to some of these aspects of sustainability that really are beginning to be more and more of an issue. And the flood and drought workshop that I was involved with earlier is just one of those territories where at last there is some serious joined-up thinking happening. In the case of Plinlimmon, the Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust and others in a partnership are really actively engaged in undoing the agricultural improvement and the forestry improvement of the last 50 or 60 years, blocking the drains and making sure that the water stays up there for longer. The interesting thing is that their motivation is absolutely about the species that we know and love. It's about wildlife. The unintended and now intended consequence of that work in habitat restoration is actually to increase the water-holding capacity of the uplands. The challenge is, how do we make that connection with the insurance industry, for instance, downstream, that is still picking up the bill for the failure in the system? Can we do rather more to weave together the expertise of the natural history community with the expertise of the river management and the water engineering community? And just as an example, in Yorkshire, the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, doing something like £2 million of the work on the upland peat bogs, they have a real cash flow problem because although that's all grant-aided money from Europe, they have to do the work up front and then claim the grant. Well, that's madness, and that's partly because I think we're failing to communicate with the right kinds of partners to make sure that we get a more joined-up approach to this kind of way of looking at the landscape. So that's a very rural example. Most of my working life is spent in this environment, in the inner city, in London particularly. And this is where I wanted to just address the second issue, which was the business of technology. This is an aerial view of a housing estate in the Elephant and Castle. Some of you may know it, some of you may even have lived there at some point in your past. It's the Haygate estate. If you Google Haygate Estate, what you get is pictures of Michael Caine being knifed in an underpass because for the last 8 years it's been empty and it's been used as a film location for cop movies and gangster movies. So it's a pretty scary place. But you will see immediately that the thing that really distinguishes it from our point of view is this extraordinary urban forest. There are 450 mature London planes on that site, 5-6 stories high, that have somehow grown and thrived. And I'm now discovering, actually, for reasons I'll explain in a second, that the reason the trees have done so brilliantly well is because they're growing in the demolished previous housing estate. There was no soil brought in, as far as I can see. The trees are really well anchored and growing in demolished brick rubble. And the challenge is to retain those trees whilst renewing the housing estate. That's a lower level view. And you can see this is a pretty extraordinary place to find in the middle of the city. The local authority had assumed that any developer who was going to redevelop would want to chop all the trees down. But actually, almost immediately, the developer got in touch, and the developer's an Australian firm called Lend-Lease. They said, well, this is our greatest asset. You know, this is a 40-year head start on where we need to try and get to with urban living if we're going to address the heat island effect, stormwater runoff, air quality issues, the calming effect of nature. Then having 40-year-old mature trees in amongst the tower blocks is a fantastic asset. How do we keep the trees? That kind of contribution is going to take another 40 years to reproduce. So hanging on to the trees is the critical thing. But the challenge is not above ground level, it's below ground level. All the stuff that goes on down below the trees, much of it has to be renewed and replaced as a part of the redevelopment. Just demolishing the buildings is a massively disruptive thing for the trees. So one of the things that I've been looking at is what technology is available to help us to deal with that. And on the left-hand side, there is some rather Heath Robinson-looking equipment, which is actually ground-penetrating radar equipment, which means that you can actually travel across the ground in that estate and see where the major roots are. So you can actually find the tree roots before you start digging. And on the right-hand side, there's another piece of technology called the air spade, which is very high-speed air jet, which blows out of the end of a tube, but blows away the soil without damaging the roots. So it's possible to actually, first of all, allocate the zones with no big roots in them for the services, and then where you do have to dig without chopping through the tree roots. And that's just a stretch of trench exposed by the air spade, showing where the roots are. Now, that's a complete revelation to most of the people dealing with this development. So even although they've bought into the idea that the trees are of value, they need to keep them, they're a way of reducing the rate of stormwater runoff, and all the stuff that we know about, most of them had no idea that the great majority of the roots on those trees are within the top half metre, probably, of the site, and that if they can find a way of working underneath them, then they can retain that fantastic natural asset. So the technology and the technologists that know about it has a really key role to play, along with the people that know about the way that trees grow. And I think that's an alliance that we've not really worked at very hard before. And the third thing I wanted to talk about was the business of alliances and comfortable and uncomfortable partnerships. So motherhood and apple pie, fish and chips, that kind of thing. And in the East End, since we were talking about the East End a second ago, the whole business of the marine environment, very close to that community, the Jellydeals and Whelks community. And the third thing I wanted to talk about was the unholy alliances. So if you then look at the work that's been going on the Essex Coast, the retreat of the sea walls, the demolition of the sea defences and the allowing in of the sea back onto the agricultural land has been a fantastic ecological success. This is Abbott's Hall, which is where the Essex Wildlife Trust headquarters is. The big opposition initially was from the Essex oystermen, who said, you bugger about with the coastline, you'll destroy our livelihood. They've found that their oyster beds have improved dramatically because there is now this big stretch of coast which is cleansing the sea rather than polluting it. And the oystermen now want to extend their oyster beds in partnership with the Wildlife Trust. Now, that's just the beginning. If you then look within that new salt marsh that's been developed, it's obviously very good for a whole range of species, but most striking of all is that in those creeks that have re-established on what's been intensive agricultural land for 150, 200 years, there are millions of fish fry, 5 commercial species of fish breeding in their millions in creeks that simply didn't exist 5 or 6 years ago. If you then begin to think about that in the context of the wider southern North Sea, there's a need to go much further and to be much bolder about how we begin not to isolate pockets of the seabed as protected areas, which seems to me to be a throwback to 40 years ago in nature conservation, but how to rebuild the seabed habitat across the piece. And to do that, I think we need quite different partners. If you look at what's happened off the western seaboard of California, it's the old gas rigs that are now seen as the most productive reef system in the whole of that system. And we have a whole bunch of structures which at the moment we intend to remove completely from the seabed. Well, the idea of changing the mindset of the people who've seen all the stuff we're interested in as what's categorised as fouling, in other words, the things that grow on their metalwork, which is the reef communities that we're looking to actually re-establish. The money that's involved in removing those structures is absolutely massive. The idea of diverting that energy and enthusiasm through partnership into rebuilding reef habitats, and then thinking a bit further about what we could do with the base of the new structures that are going into that system. So why aren't we designing the base of the wind turbines as reef systems and no-go fishery areas? Even Spanish fishermen would recognise that actually this is an area they perhaps shouldn't be sailing through. So there's an opportunity, I think, to turn the normal relationship with many of these organisations on their heads. And I'm a president, been for a long time, of the Thames Estuary Partnership. One of the things that really intrigued me about it when I first got involved was their membership list, which included, for instance, the Westminster Dredging Company. Now, we all know that the marine dredging industry is ruining the seabed, but they have the expertise to rebuild in the way that the sand and gravel industry has rebuilt wetlands in the terrestrial environment. So, although it may be uncomfortable, I just think we have to think really very, very much more energetically about how we find areas of common working where a whole range of strange bedfellows can all play to their strengths, and so that the sum of the parts can be far greater than anything that any of them as individuals can deliver. And that is me done. Thanks very much.